about military insecurity in Burma or Myanmar, whichever one you prefer. When we're talking about internal security issues in Myanmar, we're above all concerned with a political military that situates itself as sole authentic provider of security. And also, to some extent, it situates itself as the referent object of internal security, as I'm going to explain in 6 quick steps. So, looking briefly, a little bit of background at the years before military rule, then turning to the military as authentic security provider against a range of threats, then positioning the military as the referent object in itself and in relation to other key institutions. Then, as an alternative perspective, looking at society as the referent object, and if we take that referent object instead, then how might we otherwise view internal security issues in Myanmar, and ending up with a few predictions, expectations, ideas for the future, and points for discussion, comparison of Myanmar with Thailand. So let's get going with the years before and leading into military rule. Had any one of us been around at the time of independence of Burma, as it was then called, in 1948, and we wouldn't have had any reason to expect that by this time the military was the dominant institution in politics, in internal security affairs, and indeed in practically all affairs in Myanmar. At the time of independence, the army was weak and under-equipped, and there were a lot of other competing forces in public life, including competing armed forces. Burma had been devastated by World War II, had been occupied by competing armies, and had its economic infrastructure had been damaged enormously, its commercial potential had been damaged enormously. To top it off, the putative national leader, Aung San, who you can see in this slide speaking at a rally on the eve of independence, he was assassinated along with around half of his cabinet right on the eve of independence. So the political elite of the country was also thrown into turmoil right at the moment that the country obtained independence. Things didn't stop there. Subsequently, there were a range of what were described as multicoloured insurgencies, meaning insurgencies that were in some respects ideological, and some of them were ethnic-based insurgencies. For a time, the capital city itself was under siege, and the front line was only a few miles from the capital. This is a photograph of the man who would go on to become the first military dictator in Myanmar, General Ne Win, surveying troops on one of those front lines in the years after independence. The government throughout this time struggled to keep the public service intact, to build the economy and other institutions. And against this backdrop of ongoing unrest, political unrest, insurgency, the armed forces went about in the background methodically building itself up as an effective and organised institution. So, by 1958, as the elected government fell into disarray, the caretaker government, as it was called, of General Ne Win came to power. It came about basically because the Prime Minister at the time, U Nu, was put into a situation that he was told the army would not be able to control subordinate officers, and if he didn't move aside for a period, then it was quite possible that there would be a forcible takeover. So he did that, and for a couple of years, a little bit over a year and a half, the military served as an interim government with Ne Win as its head. Michael Charney, an historian of Burma, has described this as a dress rehearsal for what was to happen next. And in a sense it was, but it was also quite a dressed-down rehearsal. The military didn't occupy all positions, especially in cabinet and senior positions. It worked with civil servants, with intellectuals and other people of calibre who were not in the military institution in order to convince people that what it was doing was right for the country as a whole. And it did a lot of what militaries that take power for short periods of time like to do. It cleaned streets, it got people into their workplaces, it got the buses running, reduced crime, cleaned up rubbish, and demonstrated that it was capable of efficiently managing administrative affairs. It also cracked down heavily, though, on civil rights. It established an island prison camp where it sent a lot of political activists, and engaged in other practices that were later decried as abuses of people's basic rights. And nonetheless, when it got to the end of its term in 1960, after an extension of its original period in office, it stepped down and parliamentary government came back for a period of time. But in 1962, the military came back and took power by force, this time for good, in effect, if we look at the subsequent periods up to the present day in Myanmar. Indeed, military dictatorship of one form or another has been the characteristic of politics in Myanmar and related issues of security in Myanmar for the period after 1962. From 62 to 74, under a junta headed by Ne Win called the Revolutionary Council. From 74 to 88, under a one-party parliament, which was also under control of effectively the same persons, now in civilian clothing. 1988 to 2011, under two more military juntas. And from 2011 onwards, we see the return to legislative government and the pulling back of the military from core frontal affairs of the state, but nonetheless very strong presence of the military behind the scenes. And indeed, this picture of a statue in one part of the country demonstrates how the military presents itself as a frontal institution in all affairs of the state in Myanmar. So let's turn to some analysis. Where does that leave us in terms of the military and its role in internal security issues in Myanmar? First of all, I'd like to talk about the military as authentic security provider against 6 types of threats: secessionists, politicians, judges, students, monks, and foreigners, inverted commas. Of course, in other countries, these groups may not be classed as threats, but for one reason or another, as a result of the military takeover in Myanmar, they've fallen into categories of internal security threat. The first category, secessionists or federalists, emerged very much in response to events of the 1950s and early 1960s. The 1947 Constitution at the time of independence had provided a couple of territories of the country, including the Shan states, which are depicted in this cartoon, with a high level of autonomy, and there was also a provision to allow for them to secede from the territory of Burma if, in fact, they were dissatisfied with political progress by the period of more than 10 years had passed. So, in actual fact, by the late 1950s, there were increasing demands from people in those territories and elsewhere for federalism rather than the type of unitary state that had existed. Again, as depicted by this cartoon, with a representative from the Shan states holding a bowl out to the Prime Minister at the time and indicating that they want more than just rice grain for the dancing monkey. The continuation of federalist demands can be seen in the politics of the present day, and that's something that I think can be taken up for discussion in classes. If you look at media in the current period, since 2010, 2011 onwards, you'll see this is a continuing feature of political debate and debate concerning internal security issues in Myanmar. Second category of persons were politicians. The military blamed politicians for divisive politics, for corruption and ineptitude. These are common refrains among militaries who take power in response to the failures or alleged failures of politicians. So here again we have a picture of the Prime Minister and another prominent politician at the time, the dollar sign in the middle, indicating what the military government thinks was of interest to them rather than the interests of the people that they claim to be representing. Of course, there's some truth to the claims that the military made, but nonetheless, this was one of the pretexts that the military used for taking power and indeed for keeping professional politicians out of power for a long period of time subsequently, and again since 2011, trying to reintegrate them on terms of the military in the political process. Judges, another category of persons who became perceived as a threat to the security of the state. The military, and Ne Win in particular, had a hatred of the judiciary and the role that it had played in spoiling administrative actions and executive actions in earlier periods. One of the key targets of the Ne Win regime, and indeed of subsequent governments, has been keeping the judiciary under its control and destroying colonial-era institutions which had enabled the judiciary to play an active political part in the life of the country. Fourth category